The most expensive mistakes are not the ones that cost money. They are the ones that cost trust. It was late summer in Newport, Rhode Island, the kind of evening where the Atlantic fog rolled over the shoreline and swallowed the cliffs whole. Inside the Vance estate, the temperature was always perfectly controlled. The glass and marble mansion was a modern fortress, designed to let in the light while keeping the world entirely at bay. As Catherine Vance, I had spent the last 7 years serving as the invisible foundation that kept this sprawling empire standing. I sat at the long mahogany dining table, the surface cold beneath my forearms, working my way through the charity gala ledger. It was our 7th anniversary. For hours, I had been balancing the silent architecture of our lives. I adjusted seating arrangements for the upcoming fundraiser, carefully placing rival associates on opposite sides of the ballroom to prevent unnecessary friction. I memorized the dietary restrictions of senators' wives and the preferred vintages of shipping magnates. It was the quiet, uncelebrated labor that kept my husband's operations functioning flawlessly in public. I did not mind the endless coordination. I simply thought for a long time that it actually meant something to him. The heavy oak doors of the dining room opened. Nicholas Vance stepped inside. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, the fabric impeccable, his posture rigid with the kind of authority that commanded rooms without a single spoken word. He carried the scent of cold rain and expensive cedar. He did not look at the paperwork spread across the table. He did not ask how long I had been sitting there, or if I had eaten dinner. He simply walked toward me, his measured footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. In his right hand, my husband held a deep forest green velvet box. "For you," Nicholas said. His voice was smooth, even, and entirely practiced. He extended the small package. I stood up slowly. But before my fingers even reached for the gift, my hands moved toward his chest. It was pure, unthinking muscle memory. I reached up and gently adjusted the collar of his shirt, smoothing a slight crease near his silk tie. I checked the alignment of his lapel, making sure the armor of his public image remained absolutely flawless. The man stood perfectly still. He accepted the gesture not with warmth, but with the quiet entitlement of a leader who assumed the world would always adjust itself for him. There was no passionate embrace. There was no whispered confession of love or shared reflection on the years we had spent building this life together. Our interaction was structured like a highly rehearsed performance of high society affection. I provided the unacknowledged maintenance. He provided the material reward. Only after his collar was perfect did I lower my hands. I took the velvet box from his palm. "Happy anniversary, Catherine," he murmured. I looked at his face. His dark eyes were already drifting toward the hallway, his mind calculating the next meeting, the next phone call, the next crisis. He was physically standing in front of me, but he had left the room long before he even entered it. I looked down at the small box resting in my palm. It felt substantial, carrying the undeniable weight of significant wealth. Slowly, I lifted the lid. It was beautiful. A thick platinum band rested against the white silk interior, set with deep green, flawless emeralds. The stones caught the ambient light from the crystal chandelier above, fracturing it into sharp, brilliant shards. It was the kind of piece that required a private vault, the kind of jewelry meant to be photographed from a distance, and envied by women who did not understand the price of wearing it. "Thank you, Nicholas," I said quietly. "It is stunning." "Only the best," he replied. He checked his watch. It was a microscopic movement, a slight turn of his left wrist, but in the silent geography of our marriage, it was as loud as a slamming door. He was waiting for the transaction to be complete. The anniversary obligation had been delivered. The required gratitude had been expressed, and now he was free to return to the things that actually mattered to him. I did not take the emerald bracelet out of its silk casing. I did not ask him to fasten the clasp around my wrist. Instead, I simply ran my index finger over the cold platinum band, tracing the sharp, geometric cuts of the precious stones. The metal was freezing. It held no warmth, no history, and no genuine presence. My husband stood a few feet away, his phone vibrating in his breast pocket. He did not ignore it. His hand hovered over the fabric, signaling his immediate departure. "I have a call with the Chicago associates," he said, already taking a step backward. "I will be in my study. Have the staff clear the table when you are finished." "Of course," I answered. He turned and walked away. The heavy doors closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. I stood alone in the massive dining room. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the panoramic windows like a pale, suffocating curtain. I looked back down at the glittering gems. It was a magnificent apology for an absence he refused to acknowledge. Wealth was supposedly the foundation that protected our marriage, but in reality, it was simply the veil used to conceal its decay. I closed the small lid. It snapped shut with a sharp, hollow sound. I did not put the jewelry on. I placed the box carefully next to the charity gala ledgers. Tomorrow, I would need to file the insurance paperwork for it. Tomorrow, I would need to secure the documentation from his private files to ensure his expensive token was properly recorded in our estate records. I turned off the chandelier. I left the gift sitting in the dark. The sunrise I've wrapped in silver fog. It crept over the Newport shoreline, pressing quietly against the towering glass walls of the estate, turning the modern architecture into a pale, cold monolith. I woke early, moving through the silent hallways with the practiced grace of a woman who knew exactly how to navigate the massive, unyielding spaces of my own life. The house was immaculate, perfectly stilled, breathing only through the rhythmic hum of the central climate control. Nicholas had already left for the city. He always departed early, a ghost in tailored wool, leaving behind the scent of cedar and expensive coffee cooling on the marble kitchen island. I carried the velvet box in my right hand. The dark, plush fabric felt heavy, burdened by the platinum and flawless stones waiting inside. An emerald bracelet of that caliber was not something that simply sat in a jewelry case. It required documentation, appraisals, and immediate inclusion in the estate's comprehensive insurance portfolio. That was my role. I was the architect of his domestic fortress, the silent administrator who ensured that every facet of his empire, both public and private, remained meticulously organized and legally protected. I did not manage his illicit operations, but I managed the pristine surface that made those operations possible. The heavy mahogany door to his private study stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, my soft footsteps absorbed by the thick Persian rug. The room smelled of old paper, leather-bound volumes, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of cigar smoke. Sunlight filtered through the sheer linen drapes, casting long, geometric shadows across his massive executive desk. I walked over to the desk and set the velvet box down near the edge. My eyes drifted across the chaotic scatter of his morning departure. 2 silver fountain pens lay discarded at an irregular angle beside a stack of unopened correspondence. I paused. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached out and aligned the pens, adjusting them until they rested in perfect parallel lines. It was a small, mechanical gesture, a physical manifestation of my need to keep my environment ordered when the rest of the world felt entirely out of my control. Satisfied with the geometry, I reached for the top right drawer of the desk to retrieve the estate's primary insurance ledger. I expected the familiar resistance of the heavy brass lock. Instead, the drawer glided open with a soft, frictionless whisper. The man I married was a creature of absolute control, someone who built his life on locked doors and encrypted ledgers. For the drawer to be unlocked meant he had either been incredibly careless, or he believed himself so untouchable within these walls that he no longer bothered to turn the key. I peered into the shallow depth of the oak drawer. The leather-bound ledger sat exactly where I had left it the previous month, its pages pristine. But resting precisely on top of it was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed crest of the exclusive jeweler who had crafted my anniversary gift. It was the standard documentation envelope, the one holding the formal invoice and the certification of the stones. I needed the exact purchase date and the serial numbers for the policy rider. I picked up the envelope, feeling the heavy, expensive grain of the paper. My thumb slid under the unsealed flap, withdrawing the stiff invoice sheet. The black ink was crisp, printed with the sterile perfection of high-end commerce. My eyes scanned the top line, verifying the description of the dense metal setting and the vivid, precious stones. Then my gaze dropped to the quantity column. 2. I blinked. The silence in the study suddenly felt deafening. I lowered my eyes to the shipping details printed beneath the total sum. There were 2 distinct delivery addresses. The first was the Vance estate in Newport, designated for me. The second address was a luxury high-rise in Manhattan, a building I immediately recognized. The recipient was Evelyn Sterling, his private secretary. The woman who managed his schedule, who stood quietly in the background of corporate galas, and who, I now realized, occupied a space far more intimate than an administrative shadow. The highest prices we pay rarely involve finances. Rather, they demand the irreversible currency of faith. I did not scream. I did not drop the paper or collapse into the leather chair. Tears would have required noise. An argument would have demanded energy. The sensation blooming in my chest was entirely silent. It was a cold, absolute clarity that froze the breath in my lungs. I stared at Evelyn's name, the printed letters blurring slightly, then sharpening again. He had walked into the jeweler, selected a piece designed to represent singular devotion, and simply ordered a duplicate. It was an administrative transaction. One for the wife who kept his house immaculate, and an identical one for the woman who kept his secrets. Slowly, I lowered the invoice to the surface of the desk. There was a sharp crease across the center of the thick paper where it had been folded. With meticulous, mechanical precision, I pressed my index finger against the fold. I smoothed it out. Then I did it again. I dragged my finger back and forth across the printed ink, pressing harder each time, tracing the line until my fingertips turned a faint, smudged gray. I stood there in the quiet morning light, the velvet box resting just inches from the duplicate receipt. My dedication to this house had not changed. It had simply lost its purpose. I had spent years maintaining the flawless architecture of our marriage, only to discover I was merely occupying half of a mirrored room. The most devastating moments in a marriage rarely require raising your voice. They simply require administration. It was raining that afternoon, a cold, gray mist rolling off the Newport shoreline and pressing heavily against the panoramic glass of the estate. I stood alone in my private sitting room, far removed from the staff's usual routes through the sprawling, modern mansion. The house was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of water against the thick windows. In my left hand, I held a cheap plastic prepaid mobile phone. It felt rough, impossibly light, and entirely foreign against my palm. It was an ugly, utilitarian object standing in stark contrast to the polished mahogany, imported silk, and flawless crystal that defined Nicholas's world. In my right hand, I held the jeweler invoice. The paper was crisp, neatly folded, and carried more weight than the stone foundation of the estate beneath my feet. I dialed a number I had memorized from a discreet legal directory earlier that morning. The plastic buttons clicked sharply in the quiet room. The line rang 3 times. When a gruff, cautious voice answered, I did not hesitate. I did not take a ragged breath or pause to gather my courage. I spoke with the exact composed, melodic cadence I used when coordinating the annual charity gala or reprimanding a difficult caterer. Good afternoon, I said, my voice perfectly level, stripping the interaction of any emotional weight. I require a verification of association and surveillance. The primary subject is Nicholas Vance. The secondary individual is Evelyn Sterling. The investigator on the other end of the line paused for a fraction of a second. He was likely accustomed to tears, rage, breathless panic, or the fractured sentences of a betrayed spouse. Instead, he received a flawless recitation of logistics. I read the private residential address printed on the invoice. I provided the dates of my husband's upcoming business trips, the make of his secondary vehicle, and the exact spelling of his secretary's name. I delivered the information with the same clinical detachment I used to approve the household budget. I will need visual confirmation, a verified timeline, and photographic evidence, I continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my linen skirt. I do not need daily updates. I only need the final documented proof. Expedited, please. I provided a secure post office box I had opened that morning under my maiden name. When the call concluded, I pressed the red button, removed the plastic back of the device, and pulled out the battery. I slipped both pieces into the hidden zippered pocket of my travel bag. The transaction was complete. I turned to look out the window at the gray, churning ocean. The estate remained perfectly pristine, its temperature regulated, its surfaces gleaming. Yet, the foundation had already been quietly removed. It was merely a matter of waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the truth. The confirmation arrived 3 days later. It did not come with a dramatic confrontation, a slammed door, or a sudden storm, but on a quiet, ordinary Tuesday morning while the housekeeper was polishing the grand staircase in the foyer. A secure courier left a heavy, unmarked manila envelope at the secondary service gates. I retrieved it myself, walking the length of the gravel driveway without a coat, letting the crisp autumn air bite at my skin. I carried the package into the library and closed the heavy oak doors. The air inside the room was completely still, smelling faintly of old paper, leather bindings, and cedar wood. The temperature here was always a few degrees cooler than the rest of the house, trapped in perpetual shade. I sat in a high-backed leather armchair at Nicholas's desk. With a silver letter opener, I carefully sliced through the thick paper seal. I slid the contents onto the polished wood. The photographs were meticulously clear. The timeline was impeccably detailed. There was Evelyn, walking out of a private restaurant. There was Nicholas, holding the door. And there, caught perfectly in the flash of the camera, was the luxurious piece of jewelry resting on the other woman's wrist. In the photographs, Nicholas looked relaxed. He looked unguarded and entirely present, a version of the powerful man that I had not seen in years. I did not cry. I did not sweep the papers off the desk or tear the photographs into pieces. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something had already ended. I set the glossy images face down. Beside them sat the emerald's container, my gift, my half of the transaction. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out and opened the lid. The hinge made a soft, muted sound. The emerald bracelet rested against the dark fabric, flawless, glittering, and heavy. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, designed to signal wealth, protection, and exclusivity. I lifted it from the velvet groove. The metal was surprisingly cold against my fingertips. For the first time since the anniversary dinner, I slipped the jewelry onto my own wrist. I adjusted it over my pulse point, fastening the intricate clasp with a sharp, metallic click. I let my hand drop to the desk. The thick alloy matched the freezing temperature of the silent room. It did not feel like a symbol of devotion. It felt like a heavy, decorative shackle. It was a retainer fee for my continued presence in his glass mansion. He had purchased my silence, my loyalty, and my flawless management of his domestic life, balancing his ledger by buying the exact same piece for the woman who held his actual affection. I watched the way the green stones captured the gray, diffused light from the large window. It was a beautiful, hollow thing, purchased by a man who believed that provision and possession were the exact same thing as love. Quietly, I reached over with my other hand and unfastened the clasp. I slid the heavy metal off my skin, leaving no mark behind. The coldness lingered for only a second before my natural warmth returned. I placed the emerald bracelet back into the velvet box, aligning it perfectly within the dark fabric. I lowered the lid, pressing it shut. It made a dull, final thud in the quiet library. The lock was closed. The choice was made. Arthur Pendleton's office smelled of Lemden polish, old binding leather, and the quiet assurance of generational wealth. It was a room designed to intimidate outsiders and comfort the established elite. Rain lashed against the heavy paneled windows, distorting the gray morning light that fell across his massive mahogany desk. I sat opposite him, perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic ticking of a brass grandfather clock in the corner. The elderly man adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking down at the preliminary documents I had asked him to draft. He had known Nicholas since he was a boy, yet he had always treated me with a distinct, quiet respect. Today, that respect was laced with careful hesitation. He folded his hands over the pristine white pages. "I understand," I said quietly. I kept my voice entirely level, letting the words land without the weight of an argument. "I only want the inheritance my grandfather left me, the trust that existed before I took the Vance name. Nothing more." The family lawyer frowned, a deep crease appearing between his graying brows. He picked up a gold fountain pen, turning it slowly between his fingers. "It is highly irregular. Your husband will assume this is a negotiation tactic. A man like him understands leverage. When you ask for nothing, you confuse the ledger. There is no ledger left to balance." I looked out the window, watching a single bead of water trace a slow, jagged path down the glass. I am not negotiating for a better position. I am purchasing my absolute freedom, and the price is leaving his money exactly where it is. I knew what Arthur was waiting for. He expected the grievance. He anticipated that I would list the offenses, demand punitive damages, or expose the betrayal. He was waiting for me to mention the private safe, the hidden compartment, and the photograph of the woman with the familiar smile that Nicholas kept locked away in the dark. He expected me to name Evelyn Sterling. I did not. Some truths are too cheapened by explanation. Exposing the duplicate receipt, the second emerald bracelet, or the photograph would only turn my departure into a debate over his infidelity. It would invite his defense, his rationalization, and his inevitable attempt to buy his way back into my graces. I had no interest in hearing a man explain why he needed two identical pieces of jewelry to maintain his double life. My silence was the boundary he could not cross. "Very well," the old attorney murmured, exhaling a soft breath that ruffled the edge of the paper. He uncapped his pen and made a neat, precise adjustment to the bottom of the page. "I will isolate your family trust from the marital estate. The signed divorce papers will reflect a complete waiver of all shared funds. You are severing the tie entirely." That is exactly what I am doing. I watched him finalize the clauses. There was no triumph in the room, only the sterile quiet of a surgical removal. I did not want his cars, his estates, or the heavy stones he used to weigh down his conscience. By leaving his empire untouched, I was proving that my presence could never have been bought, and therefore could never be refunded. 3 days later, the opportunity for my physical exit arrived exactly on schedule. Nicholas departed for a logistics conference in Chicago. I stood by the front door, handing him his pressed cashmere overcoat and his leather travel case. He kissed my cheek, a dry, practiced brush of lips that felt more like a stamp of ownership than an act of affection. "I will be back by Thursday evening," he said, adjusting his silver watch without looking up. "Have the staff prepare the dining room. We have guests from the Maritime Board coming on Friday." "Safe travels," I answered. I waited until the sound of his town car's tires faded against the gravel driveway. Then I turned back into the sprawling mansion. The glass walls of the estate offered a panoramic view of the misty shoreline, but the vast rooms had never felt colder. Without his demanding schedule to dictate the rhythm of the household, the air settled into a deep, hollow stillness. My packing did not resemble a frantic escape. Leaving begins quietly. It happens the exact moment hope becomes more exhausting than disappointment. I carried a single canvas suitcase into the master suite and placed it on the edge of the bed. I did not throw clothes in anger. I folded them with the same methodical precision I had used to manage his life for 7 years. I left behind every designer gown, silk shoe, and cashmere sweater he had purchased for me. They belonged to Catherine Vance, the ornamental wife who attended galas and smiled politely at men who thought she was invisible. I packed only the simple wool skirts, the cotton blouses, and the worn leather boots I had owned before we married. I packed the books my father had given me. I packed my quiet history. By Tuesday afternoon, my side of the massive walk-in closet was stripped to the bone. The empty wooden hangers swayed slightly in the draft of the air conditioning, knocking against each other with a hollow wooden click. The visual contrast was stark. His side remained a fortress of tailored charcoal suits and pristine white shirts. My side was a ghost town. I spent Wednesday erasing the invisible architecture of my labor. I canceled my name from the household accounts, removed my signature from the staff payroll authorizations, and forwarded my mail to a private postal box. I walked through the kitchen, the conservatory, and the library, making sure every surface was immaculate. I wanted him to return to a perfect house, only to slowly realize the soul had been extracted from it. On Thursday morning, a few hours before my scheduled departure, I performed the final, clinical act of erasure. I retrieved the heavy vacuum from the hallway utility closet and carried it into the master suite. The thick, cream-colored carpet bore the faint indentations of my footsteps around the bed and the empty wardrobe. I turned the machine on, the low hum vibrating against the cold marble walls. Moving backward toward the doorway, I meticulously vacuumed my way out of the room. I dragged the nozzle in perfectly straight, overlapping lines, pulling the carpet fibers up until they stood uniformly tall. I erased the path I had walked to the closet. I erased the spot where I had stood by the window. I erased the impression of my suitcase on the rug. When I reached the threshold, I switched the power off. The sudden silence was absolute. I looked back into the bedroom one last time. The carpet was flawless, completely undisturbed, as if no one had ever lived there at all. It was not a chaotic retreat. It was an organized, undeniable withdrawal. I had unmade my existence in his world, leaving nothing behind but the cold, beautiful shell he had always prized over the woman living inside it. The end of a marriage is rarely announced with a loud, theatrical crash. It arrives quietly, sealed by the soft scratch of a pen against thick parchment. The office of Arthur Pendleton was a sanctuary of old money and strict discretion. Located in a historic brownstone, far from the corporate glass towers Nicholas favored, the room smelled of polished mahogany, aging leather bindings, and the faint, dry scent of winter heating. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a slow, measured rhythm, carving the silence into heavy, deliberate pieces. Outside, rain lashed gently against the tall, arched windows, blurring the gray afternoon sky into a watercolor wash. Arthur sat behind his massive desk, his hands resting flat against the green leather blotter. He did not offer unnecessary condolences. He did not ask me to reconsider. He simply slid the thick manila folder across the smooth wooden surface. The final legal documents were waiting inside, completely drawn up according to my meticulous instructions. I looked down at the immaculate sheets of legal text. There was no anger left in my chest, no tight, suffocating knot of betrayal. Frustration was loud. Heartbreak was loud. This absolute stillness meant that the internal tearing was already complete. I reached into my handbag and withdrew a slender, silver-cased fountain pen that had belonged to my grandmother. It was a beautiful, antiquated object, cool and heavy in my palm. I unscrewed the cap with slow, precise turns. The metal threads made a soft, continuous hiss in the quiet room. "Are you certain, Catherine?" Arthur asked. His voice was a low rumble, carrying the weight of a man who had seen decades of affluent marriages dissolve into bitter ash. He did not use my husband's surname. For the first time in years, I was simply myself. "I am completely certain, Arthur," I answered. I lowered the silver nib to the signature line. The ink flowed dark and flawless across the page. I did not rush. Every stroke was deliberate, a quiet reclamation of my own identity, detaching myself from a world where I had only ever been a placeholder. When I finished the final loop of my maiden name, I lifted the pen. I paused, leaning slightly forward, and blew gently over the wet, glistening ink. I watched the dark fluid settle and dry into the fibers of the paper, ensuring there would be no smudges, no imperfections in my departure. The document remained pristine, a clean, undeniable boundary. Arthur watched me with a respectful, guarded silence. He carefully pulled the folder back toward his side of the desk, closing it with a soft snap. "I will have these prepared for delivery," the elderly attorney said quietly, "though I suspect you have your own method of presenting them." "I do," I replied. I slipped the cap back onto my fountain pen, the soft click echoing like a lock tumbling into place. Some messages require a specific kind of silence. By Thursday afternoon, the Vance estate was completely still. The vast, modern glass and marble mansion sat high above the misty shoreline of Newport, trapping the pale, fading sunlight within its cold geometric walls. Without the hum of my quiet coordination, without the low music I usually played in the conservatory, without the faint scent of cinnamon or fresh lilies, the house felt exactly like what it was, an expensive, hollow fortress. I walked down the long, silent hallway toward my husband's private study. My footsteps made no sound on the thick, custom-woven runner. The air in the house had already begun to feel unfamiliar, as if it had memorized its schedule, yet entirely forgotten its soul. I entered the study. The room was a monument to Nicholas's absolute control. Dark walnut paneling, severe modern art, and an oversized desk dominating the center of the floor. The space was perfectly organized, yet entirely devoid of warmth. Dust motes drifted lazily through the single shaft of late-afternoon sunlight that pierced the heavy drapes. I approached the massive desk. In my hands, I carried the jeweler's original casing. Inside rested the richly colored gems, the emerald bracelet he had given me, identical to the one he had purchased for Evelyn. I did not open the lid to look at the jewelry one last time. I knew exactly what it looked like. I knew exactly what it meant. It was an apology bought with money, a transactional token meant to secure my blind loyalty while his true emotional reservoir was spent elsewhere. I placed the velvet box exactly in the center of the dark wooden desk. It sat there, a vibrant, accusing splash of color against the austere mahogany. Next, I withdrew the thick envelope containing the copies of the dissolution agreements Arthur had provided. I aligned the edge of the envelope perfectly parallel to the edge of the velvet box. The geometry of the arrangement was flawless, reflecting the meticulous, invisible labor I had poured into his life for years. Finally, I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers closed around my heavy brass house key. It was the key that granted access to this sprawling glass castle, a piece of metal I had carried every day, a symbol of my belonging to a place that had never truly been mine. I extended my hand over the desk. Carefully, with deliberate precision, I balanced the heavy brass house key precisely on top of the closed velvet box. I released my grip. The metal struck the soft, felted fabric, producing a small metallic click. In the absolute breathless silence of the empty mansion, the tiny sound echoed with devastating finality. I stood there for a long moment, simply breathing in the cool, still air. I did not feel the sudden rush of cinematic triumph, nor did I feel the crushing weight of a tragic collapse. I felt only a profound, expansive lightness. The invisible architecture of my domestic service, the endless scheduling, the quiet waiting, the swallowing of my own intuition, had completely dissolved. My capacity for deep loyalty remained completely intact. It simply no longer belonged to him by default. I turned away from the desk. I did not look back at the room, nor did I linger in the grand foyer. I walked out of the study, down the long corridor, and through the heavy front doors, stepping out into the crisp, cold autumn air. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing the quiet estate into its own permanent isolation. The black sedan pulled up to the iron gates of the Vance estate just past midnight. The crisp, coastal autumn wind whipped against the tinted windows, carrying the sharp scent of the ocean. Nicholas Vance stepped out into the biting cold, dismissing his driver with a brief nod. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored cashmere overcoat, his mind still running through the logistics of the shipping contracts he had secured in Chicago. He was a man who commanded entire rooms with a single glance, a man whose surname dictated the balance of power across the eastern seaboard. He expected what he always expected upon returning to Newport, the soft glow of the hallway sconces, the subtle warmth radiating from the kitchen, and Catherine. He expected her steady presence to anchor him. He unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the sprawling foyer. The lock clicked shut behind him with a resonant metallic finality. He stood on the imported Italian marble, waiting for the familiar sound of her footsteps descending the curved staircase. Nothing. Her name left his throat and traveled up the vast, open space of the rotunda, bouncing off the pristine glass walls and dissolving into the shadows. The echo was sharp, hollow. It was the kind of echo that only existed in a space devoid of life. He frowned, loosening his silk tie, and walked toward the grand living room. The immense crystal chandelier hung dark and motionless above the velvet seating arrangements. The ambient temperature of the house felt entirely wrong. It was not merely the autumn chill seeping through the glass. It was an absolute, sterile coldness. He moved toward the kitchen, expecting to find the residual warmth of an evening cup of tea or a single light left on above the marble island. The kitchen was immaculate. The countertops gleamed flawlessly under the moonlight. The espresso machine was cold to the touch. The silver tray where she kept his mail was completely empty. Catherine. He spoke the name again, louder this time, his voice cutting through the stillness. Still, the house offered no reply. A slow, creeping sensation began to spread through his chest, a physical tightening that had nothing to do with the freezing coastal wind outside. He paused in the center of the hallway, taking a deep breath. The air itself was different. For the past 6 years, the estate had always carried the faint, elegant note of French lavender, her signature scent woven into the fabric of the upholstery, the fresh linens, the very atmosphere of their home. Now, the air tasted like dust and chilled glass. It had been scrubbed clean. The perfect domestic order surrounding him was no longer a symbol of her meticulous care. It was the precise, terrifying architecture of an empty home. He had spent his entire life building an empire of stone, money, and absolute control, but standing in the flawless perfection of the foyer, the perfect silence felt entirely unmanageable. He turned toward the east wing, his private study. Nicholas walked down the corridor, his leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor in a slow, measured cadence. He did not run. Men in his position did not run. They calculated, but the tightness in his throat betrayed the polished exterior he projected to the world. He reached the heavy double doors of his office and pushed them open. The moonlight spilled across the dark Persian rug, illuminating the massive oak desk that anchored the room. Nicholas stopped just inside the threshold. His eyes immediately locked onto the center of the desk. 3 objects sat perfectly aligned on the polished wood, illuminated by the pale, silvery light. He approached slowly, the quiet in the room pressing against his eardrums. He did not need to turn on the brass lamp to recognize what she had left. There, resting precisely in the middle of his blotter, was the velvet box. Balanced precisely on top of it was a single heavy brass house key, her key to the estate. Beside the box lay a thick, heavy stack of crisp legal parchment. His hands, which had dismantled rival syndicates and signed away millions without a tremor, felt inexplicably heavy as he reached for the velvet box. He flipped the golden clasp and lifted the lid. The emerald bracelet sat nestled in the silk cushion, the perfectly cut stones catching the sparse light. It was the exact piece of jewelry he had presented to her on their anniversary, the expensive token he had believed would bridge the widening gap between them. It had not been a gift of genuine presence, it had been a transaction. He stared at the untouched stones. The heavy weight of the emerald bracelet in his palm was a mocking reminder of his own arrogance. He had believed that provision was an acceptable substitute for devotion. He set the velvet box back onto the desk and lowered his gaze to the paperwork. The bold black text at the top of the page required no translation. The executed separation forms were immaculate. He traced his thumb over the bottom line, where her elegant, unwavering signature rested in dark blue ink. Catherine Vance. She had not left a long, emotional letter. She had not shattered the crystal decanters or torn the leather-bound books from the shelves. She had simply dismantled his authority with a single stroke of a pen. His gaze drifted past the papers to the top right drawer of his desk, the secure drawer where he kept his private ledgers, the insurance files, and the jeweler's invoice. The drawer was shut, but the lock was disengaged. The realization struck him with the blunt force of a physical blow. The duplicate receipt. The second emerald bracelet shipped to Evelyn. The hidden photograph of his past that he had refused to let go of. Catherine had opened the drawer to file the insurance, and she had seen the exact scale of his betrayal. She had learned that she was merely a placeholder in a life built on a shadow. Nicholas did not scream. He did not sweep the velvet box off the desk or hurl his crystal glass against the wall. The explosive violence that defined his public reputation evaporated entirely in the private coldness of his study. Instead, he stepped back, his knees giving way, and slumped into his heavy leather chair. He sat in the dark, the emeralds gleaming faintly, the divorce papers staring back at him. The house above him was perfectly silent, its massive glass walls offering no comfort, no warmth, no absolution. He had meticulously controlled every variable of his vast empire, only to discover that he possessed absolutely nothing of value. The stillness in the room was absolute, and for the first time in his life, Nicholas had no idea how to command it. The historic district of the city was governed by a different kind of quiet. It was not the sterile, pressurized silence of the glass mansion overlooking the harbor, where every sound felt swallowed by cold marble. Here, the silence was woven from the rustle of autumn leaves scraping against brick, the distant hum of a baker's exhaust fan, and the muffled rhythm of ordinary lives. I stood in the shadowed living room of my new brownstone, a steaming cup of chamomile resting on the windowsill, and watched the heavy, armored sedan pull to a stop near the curb below. The vehicle belonged to a world I had already packed into a velvet box and left behind. Its dark, polished chassis looked entirely out of place on the narrow, tree-lined street. A moment later, the rear door opened. Nicholas Vance stepped out onto the damp pavement. He wore his customary tailored charcoal overcoat, the collar turned up against the biting autumn wind. For years, I had watched that coat sweep into boardrooms, backroom negotiations, and high society galas, carrying the undeniable weight of an empire. He was a man accustomed to doors opening before he even reached for the handle. Men of immense wealth rarely had to knock, and they never waited. Yet, as he stood beneath the flickering amber halo of a solitary street lamp, his power evaporated into the crisp Maine evening. He did not walk toward the steps immediately. Instead, he simply stood there, staring up at the warm, golden square of light radiating from my second-story window. From my vantage point in the dark, I could see the rigid tension in his shoulders, the slow, visible exhale of his breath pluming in the freezing air. The men he commanded could dismantle rival syndicates and erase financial records without a trace, but none of that leverage could force open a standard brass deadbolt on a century-old residential door. His criminal authority ended precisely where the wrought iron gate of my building began. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, a nervous micro-gesture he only employed when an acquisition was failing. The empire he built was vast, but for the first time in his life, he was calculating the exact dimensions of an obstacle he could not purchase, intimidate, or charm. The man who could secure millions in a single afternoon was currently paralyzed by 3 concrete steps and a locked wooden door. A couple walking their dog passed by him on the sidewalk, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were brushing shoulders with a feared cartel architect. To them, he was just another man left standing in the cold. I did not step back from the glass. I let him see my silhouette against the drawn curtains. My absence was not a temporary retreat or a tactical negotiation. It was a finished geography. He took a hesitant step forward, his polished shoes crunching against dried maple leaves, leaving the safety of the street lamp to approach the entry panel of the building. The sharp, abrasive buzz of the intercom shattered the peace of my apartment. It was a crude, mechanical sound, completely devoid of the hushed discretion of the estate's domestic staff. I let it ring a second time, the noise vibrating against the painted hallway walls, before setting my mug down. I walked toward the small, yellowed plastic box mounted near the door. For a decade, his voice had reached me through the finest acoustics, across sweeping mahogany dining tables, through the quiet leather interior of private jets, or murmured over the rim of crystal champagne flutes. Now, as I pressed the worn metal button, he was reduced to a crackling burst of static. "Catherine," the intercom rasped. Distorted by the cheap microphone, his voice was stripped of its usual commanding baritone. It sounded thin, desperate, and entirely human. I did not reply immediately. I listened to the hollow, wind-swept silence filtering through the speaker, measuring the precise distance between the life I had surrendered and the peace I had reclaimed. "I know you can hear me," he said, the static popping between his words. "Please, just open the door. Let me come up." I leaned slightly closer to the panel, my posture completely relaxed. My pulse remained steady, unbothered by the sudden proximity of the man who had structured my entire existence. "You are trespassing on a quiet evening, Nicholas. I have the box," he said. The urgency in his tone spiked, a frantic edge cutting through the electronic interference. "The emerald bracelet, I brought it back. You left it on the desk. You didn't even take the insurance papers. Just let me up so we can talk about this. I can explain the receipt. I can explain all of it." It was a staggering display of emotional blindness. He still believed that a conversation, a justification, or a heavier piece of jewelry could rewrite the fundamental architecture of our marriage. He thought the issue was a misunderstanding over a purchase, entirely missing the reality that the foundation had already crumbled beneath his feet. The identical bracelets were merely the final proof of a long, invisible decay. "There is nothing left to explain," I answered quietly. "The transaction was completed. You gave the gift and I returned it." "Catherine, please," he begged, the words sounding foreign and jagged coming from him. "Don't do this. I am standing out here in the freezing cold. I just want 5 minutes. One conversation." I looked over my shoulder, toward the small kitchen, where a fresh pot of water had just finished boiling. The ambient warmth of my new home wrapped around me, a stark contrast to the freezing pavement he was currently anchored to. I did not feel triumph, nor did I feel the sharp sting of vindictive anger. I simply felt the profound, spacious relief of a finished task. "The tea is getting cold, Nicholas," I said softly. Before he could form another promise, before the static could carry another frantic excuse, I lifted my finger from the button. The connection severed with a sharp, definitive click. The silence that flooded the apartment afterward was beautiful. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the glass mansion waiting for his approval. It was the light, breathable stillness of a room that finally belonged only to me. I walked away from the door, leaving the undisputed boss of a criminal empire entirely alone in the dark, speaking to an empty speaker on a brick wall. The downtown offices of the legal firm were deliberately sterile. Far removed from the dark wood and leather of the Vance estate, the glass-walled conference room offered no shadows to hide in. Nicholas Vance sat at the long mahogany table, staring out at the manicured skyline. The morning light, filtering through the blinds, was pale and unforgiving. For years, he had operated under the assumption that power was absolute, that fear could bridge any gap and wealth could purchase any loyalty. Today, that illusion ended on a stack of pristine legal sheets. Arthur Pendleton sat opposite his wealthiest client, his posture impeccably formal. The elderly family lawyer did not offer a glass of scotch or professional reassurance. There was only the quiet sliding of a dark leather folder across the polished surface. Inside rested the uncontested divorce papers. "She asked for nothing," Arthur said. His voice was completely devoid of judgment, which somehow made the statement feel like a physical blow. No alimony. No division of the offshore accounts. Only the legal dissolution of the marriage, effective immediately. Nicholas stared at the black ink on the final page. Catherine's signature was already there. It was perfectly composed, lacking any sign of rushed hesitation or lingering anger. The elegant loops of her name looked exactly as they had on the hundreds of household schedules she had meticulously managed for him. He remembered the deep green velvet box sitting empty on his desk. He remembered the dead silence of the intercom. The man accustomed to giving unquestioned orders felt a strange, suffocating tightness in his chest. His reputation as an untouchable boss meant absolutely nothing in this bright room. He could not intimidate a memory. He could not bribe a woman who had already walked away from a massive fortune simply to reclaim her own peace. Slowly, the executive reached for the silver fountain pen resting beside the documents. As he lifted it from the table, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. His fingers were shaking. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, but it was undeniably there. A man who commanded underground logistics could not steady his own hand to sign away the only person who had ever truly anchored him. He pressed the nib to the paper. The scratch of metal against the heavy stock was the only sound. With 3 jagged strokes, he surrendered his control. He left the pen on the table, refusing to look up at the older attorney. The loss was total. It was a quiet, bureaucratic severing, sealed by his own hand. The coast of Maine arrived draped in the crisp, bright light of late autumn. 2 months had passed since I left that key on that heavy mahogany desk. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of salt water and pine as I walked through the small, sunlit park near my new home. The branches overhead were turning a brilliant gold, leaves falling gently onto the cobblestone paths. I walked at my own pace. There were no private security details trailing behind me. There were no strict social schedules to keep, and no ghosts of childhood friends to compete with. The future did not feel like a cage anymore. It felt like an open road. Returning to my brownstone, I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet warmth of my own space. It was a modest building, far smaller than the sprawling glass mansion, but every inch of it belonged entirely to me. I had filled the rooms with the things I actually loved: worn historical novels, woven blankets, and framed prints of coastal landscapes. There were no hidden steel safes here. There were no secrets locked away in the dark. I walked into the library, a cozy room with tall sash windows facing the quiet harbor. The morning sunlight poured across the hardwood floor, pooling in warm patches over the vintage rug. I moved to the small kitchenette and prepared a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea, listening to the rhythmic bubbling of the kettle. It was an ordinary sound, a small, invisible domestic detail, yet it was exactly these ordinary moments that slowly rebuilt a broken spirit. Taking the warm ceramic mug, I sat in the deep armchair by the window. I set the tea down on the windowsill and rested my arms on the armrests. I looked down at my wrists. They were completely bare. For years, I had worn the heavy platinum bands, the diamond tennis bracelets, and the suffocating expectations that came with his infamous name. Now my skin was unadorned. There was no heavy emerald bracelet cutting into my flesh. There was no matching jeweler's receipt sitting in a drawer, whispering that my value was only half of a transaction. The lightness of my own skin felt intoxicating. It was the pure, physical sensation of absolute autonomy. What you choose to lock away is often what you value most, but the lock itself is what keeps love from growing. My former husband had spent a lifetime building an empire of stone and guarded vaults, only to learn too late that a home is built from something else entirely. True devotion could never be purchased with precious stones, and it could never be kept inside a velvet box. I picked up my tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. The gentle warmth bloomed in my chest. Outside the glass, the autumn wind rustled the golden leaves, carrying the inevitable promise of a cold winter. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid of the cold. My warmth remained exactly the same. It simply belonged to me now.